My name is Maya Sinclair, and I've spent 28 years being the punchline of every family gathering. Not the cruel kind of joke that leaves you crying in bathroom stalls, but the gentle, patronizing kind that's somehow worse because everyone thinks they're being supportive. Maya's artistic, they'd say with indulgent smiles, the same tone you'd use for a child who insists they're going to marry their imaginary friend. She's so creative with her little cakes. Little cakes. As if the three-tier wedding masterpieces I stayed up until 4 a.m. perfecting were dollhouse furniture. As if the corporate events I catered for law firms and medical practices were tea parties. As if Sinclair Suites, the business I'd built from my studio apartment kitchen into a full commercial space, was just an elaborate way to avoid getting a real job. The worst part, I'd started to believe them. That's why, when Mrs. Holloway called in September asking if I could cater her daughter's engagement party, I almost said no. Not because I couldn't handle it, but because a part of me had internalized my family's voice whispering that I was just playing pretend. Mrs. Holloway was quiet, unassuming, the kind of woman who spoke softly but chose her words with precision. Her daughter was marrying into what she called a prominent local family, and they needed everything to be perfect. When she mentioned the guest count, 200 people, I nearly choked on my coffee. "I know it's a large order," she said gently, "but I've seen your work at the Morrison wedding last spring. It was extraordinary. The Morrison wedding. I remembered that one. 18 months of planning. A cake that took me 3 days to decorate. Sugar flowers so realistic the bride's grandmother tried to smell them. My cousin Derek had been there, had taken photos of my work, but when he posted them on social media, he'd captioned it, 'Maya's hobby is getting out of hand.' Faced with tears of joy, I took Mrs. Holloway's job. For 6 weeks, I threw myself into that engagement party like my life depended on it. French macarons in the couple's wedding colors, a dessert bar that looked like something from a high-end magazine, petit fours so delicate they looked like jewelry. I hired 2 assistants, rented professional equipment, and worked 16-hour days until my hands cramped and my back ached. The party was flawless. Mrs. Holloway found me as I was packing up, tears in her eyes. "Maya," she said, gripping my flour-dusted hands, "you've given my daughter something magical. This isn't just catering, it's art." I smiled and deflected, the way I'd learned to do. Just glad everyone enjoyed it. She studied my face for a long moment. "You don't see it, do you? What you've created here." I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't. 3 weeks later, she called again. Not for another event, just to talk. She'd been thinking about our conversation, she said. About how I downplayed my own work. She mentioned that she worked in publishing, had connections in food media, wondered if I'd ever considered reaching out to magazines or food bloggers. I laughed it off. My family says I should focus on getting a real career first. The silence on her end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "Maya," she said finally, "would you be willing to trust me for just a moment? I'd like to make a few calls." I said yes without thinking. What was the worst that could happen? Now, 6 weeks later, I stood in my mother's dining room, watching my Uncle Pete carve the turkey with the same confidence he brought to every family gathering. Pete was my father's older brother, an insurance executive who'd never met a conversation he couldn't dominate or a success story he couldn't diminish. "So Maya," he said, not looking up from the bird, "still playing with your little cakes?" The table chuckled. Not meanly, but with that familiar condescension that made my chest tight. My cousin Sarah, who worked in marketing, jumped in with fake enthusiasm. "Oh, Maya's baking thing is so cute. I saw the photos from that party you did. Very Pinterest why." Pinterest why? As if 6 weeks of meticulous planning and execution could be reduced to something you'd find on a mood board. My mother, bless her, tried to help. "Maya works very hard. She's gotten quite good at it." Quite good. Like I was a promising student in a community college pottery class. Mrs. Holloway sat quietly at the corner of the table, having accepted my mother's invitation when she'd run into her at the grocery store earlier that week. She'd been so kind to me that I'd mentioned her to Mom, who'd immediately invited her to join our family dinner. "Any friend of Maya's is welcome," she'd said, though I caught the subtle emphasis on friend, as if she couldn't imagine I'd have professional connections worth mentioning. Uncle Pete finally looked up, grinning with that particular brand of masculine confidence that comes from never having been questioned. "Maya's little baking thing is so adorable," he announced to the table. "Maybe one day she'll get a real job. You know, something with benefits, security, a future." He winked at me. "No shame in being creative as a hobby, kiddo, but at some point you've got to think practically." The familiar heat rose in my chest. The same feeling I'd had at every graduation, every birthday, every family gathering where my achievements were measured against some invisible standard I'd never be able to reach. I opened my mouth to defend myself, then closed it. What was the point? But Mrs. Holloway was standing. Slowly, deliberately, like she was rising to give a eulogy. The table fell quiet, forks suspended halfway to mouths. She was such a soft-spoken woman that her sudden movement commanded attention in a way shouting never could. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying despite its gentleness. She was pulling out her phone, her movements careful and intentional. "But you should know that your little baking thing," she paused, tapping her screen, was just featured as the cover story in Metropolitan Food and Wine magazine's holiday issue. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away. Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice growing stronger. The article is titled Hidden Gems, the pastry artist redefining luxury catering. Maya's work was described as transcendent and museum-quality edible art. She turned her phone around. There, on the glossy digital cover of one of the region's most prestigious culinary magazines, was a photo of my engagement party dessert display. And below it, in elegant serif font, Maya Sinclair, the pastry virtuoso you need to know. Uncle Pete's fork clattered against his plate. "But that's not all," Mrs. Holloway continued, swiping through her phone. "The James Beard Foundation has invited Maya to participate in their Rising Stars showcase next spring. Food Network reached out last week about a potential feature. And," she paused, meeting my eyes with a small smile, "3 Michelin-starred restaurants have contacted her about consulting opportunities." My mother was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Maya, is this true?" I nodded, suddenly unable to speak. I'd been planning to tell them, but every time I'd tried, someone had changed the subject or made a joke about my cute little hobby. Mrs. Holloway wasn't finished. "Your daughter created something extraordinary for my family. When food industry professionals saw those photos, they didn't see a hobby. They saw artistry. They saw innovation. They saw exactly what I saw the moment I tasted her work. Pure talent that deserves recognition." She sat back down, folding her hands calmly in her lap, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of our family dinner. Uncle Pete cleared his throat. "Well, I always knew Maya was talented, You just what?" The voice was mine, but I barely recognized it. "You just thought it was cute that I spent 60 hours a week building something I was passionate about? You thought it was adorable that I turned down corporate jobs to pursue something that actually mattered to me." The table was frozen. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. Usually, I smiled and nodded and let their dismissal wash over me like rain. "Maya," my father said carefully, "we didn't know. Because you never asked." The words came out steadier than I felt. "For 3 years, I've been trying to tell you about orders, about features in local papers, about corporate contracts. But every time I brought it up, someone made a joke or changed the subject or told me I needed to be more practical." My cousin Sarah was staring at her phone. "Maya, I'm looking at this article. It says you've catered events for the governor's office, and that your waiting list is 8 months long, and that your average event budget is..." She looked up, eyes wide. "Is this real?" I nodded. "That engagement party I did for Mrs. Holloway's daughter? That was a $40,000 contract. The corporate events I cater bring in anywhere from $15,000 to $60,000 each. Last month, I hired my 4th full-time employee." The silence stretched like taffy. My mother reached for her wine glass with shaking fingers. Mrs. Holloway leaned forward slightly. "Maya, would you like to tell them about the call you got yesterday?" I looked at her, confused. "We hadn't spoken yesterday." She smiled gently. "From the Culinary Institute. About the teaching position." My breath caught. "How did you?" "I may have made a few more calls than I mentioned," she said softly. "I hope you don't mind. But when I see talent being undervalued, I tend to get protective. The teaching position. The one I'd dreamed about but never thought I was qualified for. The one that would let me keep running my business while sharing what I'd learned with the next generation of pastry chefs." Uncle Pete set down his carving knife. "Maya, I owe you an apology. We all do." I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything. But maybe next time, before you decide someone's work isn't important, you could ask them about it first." The rest of dinner passed in a blur of questions, apologies, and amazed exclamations as family members Googled my business and discovered a whole world of success they'd never bothered to see. My teenage nephew found a YouTube video of me demonstrating sugar work techniques that had racked up 500,000 views. My aunt discovered that several of her friends had been trying to book me for months. As we cleared the dessert plates, store-bought pie ironically, Mrs. Holloway caught my arm. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for everything. But how did you know about the Culinary Institute?" She smiled. "I didn't. But I know talent when I see it, and I know what happens when talented people don't believe in themselves. Sometimes we all need someone to stand up and remind the room what we're really worth." Later that evening, as I drove home through the quiet streets, my phone buzzed with text after text. Apologies, congratulations, and requests for information from family members who suddenly wanted to know everything about my business. But the message that made me smile came from Mrs. Holloway. "I hope you know that what happened tonight wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about you finally seeing what the rest of us have known all along. You're not playing at being successful. You are successful. There's a difference." She was right. For years, I'd been waiting for permission to call myself a real business owner, a real artist, a real success. Permission that was never going to come from people who couldn't see past their own limited definitions of achievement. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the small commercial kitchen I'd built in my converted garage. Tomorrow, I'd be back to work, creating edible art for people who understood its value. Next spring, I'd be standing in front of culinary students, teaching them not just technique, but the importance of believing in their own worth. And if anyone ever called it a cute little hobby again, I'd have Mrs. Holloway's voice in my head, reminding me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up and tell the truth. The truth was simple. I wasn't playing house with flour and sugar. I was building an empire, one perfect cake at a time.